Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Cameras and Coffee. And in today's video, we're going to talk about the new Fuji 50mm f1.0 autofocus lens because it is very exciting. Even not being a Fuji shooter myself, having never even touched a Fuji digital camera, I think it's an awesome looking lens. It's the kind of lens that if I were in the market to switch systems, would make me strongly consider Fuji as my system. So let me go into the press release text, which was leaked, and there's a link to this, of course, in the video description. And we'll talk about some of the interesting technical points and what they mean. And then after this, since we're on the subject of Fuji and 50mm lenses, the other day, Andrew from the Andrew and Danae channel asked me about 50mm lenses if they're really a normal field of view. We'll talk about that later in this video. Oh, and one other thing, really quickly, before we jump into any of this, let me shill my awesome new shirt. A few weeks, maybe a couple months ago, one of you suggested that if you take care of your camera will take care of you slogan that I say at the end of the first part of every video manual would make a good shirt. I went back to try to find that comment so I could specifically thank you for that idea, and I couldn't find that comment. But here it is. If you take care of your camera will take care of you, the David Hancock channel with my logo. I redid the Teespring storefront that's underneath all of my videos to add a bunch new shirt options and things like that. So if that is something that you're interested in, this is what it looks like. It turned out really well. I'm very happy with the result. At any rate, let's get back to the Fuji XF 50mm f1 RLMWR press release. The lens looks amazing, by the way. So it is the world's first f1.0 autofocus lens for mirrorless cameras. Now that in and of itself is impressive because when a lens gets really fast, it also tends to get really soft. So I've been shooting a lot of f1.2 lately for part of an upcoming video series about super fast lenses. The old Olympus Zuiko 55mm f1.2, the Nikon, I don't own this lens anymore, but 55mm f1.2, a bunch of 35mm f1.2 lenses for Sony E-mount, I think 5 of them, including the 7 Artisans and some others. One thing that they have all had in common, at f1.2, also most of them at 1.4 and 1.8-ish, Sony's focus peaking cannot recognize what is in focus because the lenses are that soft wide open. So that's a problem. At f1, if autofocus is working, that means that the lens wide open is sharp enough for the autofocus to detect what is and is not in focus, which says a lot about the optical quality of the lens from a sharpness perspective. So also says a lot about the quality of the autofocus motor because a 50mm f1 is a very, very heavy optic. I don't remember if the weight was specified in this or not, but that means that the autofocus motor is going to be moving a lot of mass and it's going to have a high torque. So that's an impressive aspect about the autofocus motor. The next thing that's really exciting about this is that the autofocus will operate at -7 Ev Luminance. So we're talking exposure value here. In general, if you're unfamiliar with exposure value, it's calculated off of 100 ISO. So what is -7 EV? That number in and of itself might not mean anything to you. So I've got another link here to a Photograpghylife article, but in general, as a rule of thumb, if you are shooting the Sunny 16 rule, 1/125th of a second, 100 ISO, f16, sunny day, sun to your back, that's EV15, okay? EV -7 is a whole lot less light. At f1, on that same sunny day, if you're shooting with the sun to your back, EV15 is 1/32,000th of a second. That's at f1. At f16, it's 1/125th. So that's a sunny day. If you're shooting -7, if you get down to a point that you're shooting -7 EV at f10, that is a 120-second exposure. That's how little light there is. So -7 EV at f10 at 100 ISO is 2 minutes. That's longer. That's like shooting under a new moon. That's Milky Way exposure type territory with lots and lots of star movement. That's an incredibly sensitive autofocus sensor. -7 is such a, I can't even really fully express how little light that is. If you've never left a city, you've only experienced -7 EV if you've been in an interior room of a building and had the power go out. So that's really low light. And then, so the rest of the Fuji Addict article about the lens with the press release, it's an incredibly impressive lens, this new Fuji 50mm. And and then the other one, the Photograpghylife, has a table that explains how EV works and the relative EV values across the whole spectrum of EV ranges. So at any rate, that's those two articles. The next thing I wanted to touch on is a 50mm lens a normal, is that what we see with our eyes? Everyone has heard this in photography class, right? There's just one thing. It's only kind of true. So first thing we got to do is get into the way that human vision works. So there are some things we need to understand about vision before we get any further. The first is that you don't see anything with your eyes. Your brain does all the seeing. Saying that you see something with your eyes is like saying a digital camera takes pictures with the sensor. No, it doesn't. The sensor records photons, and then that data is converted into an image by the computer and the algorithms within the digital camera. So your brain is basically doing what the digital camera's computer does. It takes the photons that your eyes record, and then it turns them into an image. That's what we perceive. There's a lot of complexity to that, which is way beyond the scope of this video. And because our brains are what see the world and perceive it, differences in perception are what can be chalked up to or explained as differences in sight. So mostly what we see is our brain's perception of external stimuli. Now, there are some links in the video description, again, to back some of this up. In general, when we talk about what people can see, there is a human field of view, a researchgate.net article about the human field of view. So basically, humans can see around, including all of our peripheral vision, from corner to corner. So if I hold my arm way out here, I can still perceive that my phone is over here. I can't make anything out on it, but I can see it out of the corner of my eye. So humans generally see 107 degrees corner to corner. That's not all in focus. What's in focus is around 13 degrees in the very center of our vision. And then surrounding that is an area of, let me get my numbers correct, 30 degrees, where we can still make out most of the details, okay? And so then there are a few different divisions of peripheral vision going from 13 to 30 out to 107. So what does that mean in field of view? If we're talking about 35mm lenses, 107 degrees is very close to 13mm. That's pretty darn wide. That is wider than what's generally considered ultra wide, way wider than what's considered ultra wide. So 14mm lenses are 104 degrees, 104.3. So including peripheral vision, which is what we can see that's not in focus, where we can just basically pick up motion, that's wider than a 14 millimeter. So what about what's in focus in the center of our eyes, that 13 degrees? That is approximately equivalent to a 150 millimeter lens. Now there's a big difference. A 150 millimeter lens is taking that 13 degrees and filling the entire frame, so it brings it closer. Our eyes aren't doing that. Our eyes are just seeing that 150 millimeter approximately central area in focus. But that's only at one given time. Our eyes are constantly moving around a scene. And so when we see things, our brain is perceiving multiple different moments, multiple different views from our eyes, and compiling those into an image. So for instance, right now I'm looking at my camera, and my camera is occupying that central 13 degrees. Beyond that, I have my wall and some paintings, an air filter, my kitchen table, things like that. I can perceive all of them, and I can see them with relative sharpness, even though they're outside of that central part of my view. But that's because as I've been talking, my eyes are moving around. They look at an electrical socket, they look at the table, back and forth. And because my eyes are moving, then my brain is remembering what those things looked like while they were sharp and keeping those in its memory as sharp parts of my field of view. So where does this statement about 50 millimeter lenses representing human view come from? Well, it has to do with the magnification. So with 35 millimeter, a 50 millimeter lens magnifies the world very slightly less than what we see when when that image from that 50 millimeter lens is projected onto film. So 58 millimeter is actually very, very close to the magnification that we see when it's projected onto film. But that's not true for everybody. Because vision is within our brains, and because it's a function of perception, not a function necessarily of the way that our eyes physically work, different people focus on and perceive the world in different ways. So I've heard from people who see the world and who perceive it in a similar fashion to the way that a 65 millimeter lens projects light onto a sensor or film, full frame sensor or 35 millimeter film. I personally see the world a little bit wider. To me, a 43 millimeter lens is spot on to what I see in terms of magnification and general sharpness. A 35 millimeter lens is roughly what we see with the core of our peripheral vision. So if we take that what's most in focus and then what we can really perceive details of, that's roughly a 35 millimeter lens angle of view. So there's lots of ways to cut up the way that perception is mirrored or not mirrored by cameras and lenses. But I think the easiest way to think about it is that in general, when we see the world, what we can focus on at any time is approximately the same size as what's projected by a 50 millimeter lens, but our actual field of view is way more complicated than that, and the way that our brains perceive the world mean that it's not there's no true connection between the way that cameras work and lenses work and the way that the human brain perceives the world. The best we can do is mimic it or have images that see things about like we do. And this is a big part of why it is that different photographers have different views, and why some photographers will be drawn to a 24 millimeter lens, like I am for wide angles. Some will see a 28 millimeter lens as being a better wide angle option. Some photographers prefer telephotos or 58 or 65 as opposed to a 50 or a 45. Some photographers prefer a 14 millimeter lens versus a 12 or an 18. And so my general theory on why photographers are drawn to different focal lengths is that we all perceive, our brains all perceive the world differently. So a photographer who does really well with one focal length probably has a closer connection to that focal length in the way that they're perceiving the world than another photographer who does really well with a different focal length. I hope that explains a little bit about the myth of the 50mm lens mirroring our vision. It truly doesn't. It only mirrors the approximate size that we see things. And again, also one other thing to bear in mind is that the size that we see things is somewhat dependent on how focused we are on them. So when our brains perceive something that we are more enamored with, we generally tend to perceive it as being a little bit larger. So at any rate, there's many different things like that that affect our perception of the world. So that's it for today. Very exciting new lens from Fuji, and the 50mm lenses, and of course, new David Hancock channel logo swag. So if you don't want the full circle with the catchphrase, there are also versions of this that just have my logo on it. Coffee mugs as well. My new coffee mug hasn't arrived, but at any rate, if you get a chance to check them out, I would like that. They're right below the video in the Teespring shelf that is part of YouTube. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you in the next Cameras and Coffee.